Welcome back to Ravenous Babble. My name is Dan, and today we'll be babbling on about Viserai, Rune Blood, my main hero in Flesh and Blood. This one's going to go back to my first encounter with Flesh and Blood, which was on YouTube through Alpha Investments, as I'm sure it was for quite a few people, around March of 2020. Flesh and Blood had just begun to pick up in popularity, and I saw Rudy's What is Flesh and Blood TCG video. The game had definitely piqued my interest, but it wasn't enough for me to pull the trigger, especially not in March of 2020. I'm pretty sure I had just spent about $2,000 on 10 dual lands in March of 2020, so I was pretty deeply invested in Magic. It would have taken a lot to pull me out of Magic at that time. Now, if I had sat down and played the game, maybe not. A few days later, Rudy followed up with his Steve Argyle preview card video. This was the first time that I saw Viserai Rune Blood, the first time that the world saw Viserai Rune Blood, and I knew that if I was going to play Flesh and Blood, I would have to try Viserai. He looked badass. His art was made by Steve Argyle, who at the time was a big name artist in the Magic the Gathering community, mostly known as the artist who made Liliana of the Veil, which was a very powerful and popular modern staple at the time. Fast forward to earlier this year when, honestly, completely out of the blue, I became curious about Flesh and Blood. I'm not sure what caused it exactly. I think it was a combination of things. No one walked up to me and said, "Have you heard of our Lord and Savior Flesh and Blood?" or anything like that. I hadn't even seen anyone actually play the game in person. But I went into my LGS probably to get Magic product or sleeves or something, and I noticed that there was Flesh and Blood stocked on the shelves. Now, in my mind, from what I'd been hearing, Flesh and Blood was impossible to get. It was overpriced. It was essentially the 2020-2021 saga of Flesh and Blood. And that narrative had changed at this point. But I wasn't aware, not yet. I thought to myself, oh, that's cool. I guess that game is still alive. I guess it's available. That's great for the players who play it. And then I bought my Magic product and I went home. And I think through, again, Alpha Investments, I had discovered that the first ever Pro Tour happened in Flesh and Blood. Pro Tour New Jersey. Now, if you aren't already aware, I live in New Jersey. And at the time, I wasn't too upset about it. But nowadays, it's one of my biggest regrets. I found out about this, and I started getting into the game 2 weeks after Pro Tour New Jersey. Biggest regret in the game. But it is what it is. You can't change the past. We can only move forward from here and, go to every Flesh and Blood event I possibly can. Enjoy the game, enjoy the community. Make memories. Anyway, I asked my wife if she'd want to try the game with me. Gave her a brief synopsis of what the game's like, and she said yeah. We looked at the Heroes of Wraith page on fabtcg.com, and each selected a hero to play. She picked Benji, and I chose Viserai, remembering those Alpha Investments videos from 2 years prior. Not really sure where to start. I just went ahead and Googled Flesh and Blood starter decks. I found a website called fabstarterdecks.com. It seemed like they made starter decks from bulk, and they were priced very reasonably. So I picked up the Benji starter deck and the Viserai starter deck. To my dismay, while researching the game, waiting for the decks to come in the mail, I learned about the Living Legend system, and some of you might know where I'm going with this. Shortly before Pro Tour New Jersey, Viserai had attained Living Legend status in the Blitz format, which meant that he was banned from the format for winning too many tournaments. This news was unfortunate, but we didn't care too much since we were just trying the game out, learning to play. We played our first game after reviewing a Learn to Play video, and I was immediately blown away. This game was so simple to learn the rules for, and I was like, this is going to be easy. So we drew our hands, and immediately I saw how deep this game could go. I had had my first taste, and I wanted more. So I started looking into where I could play Viserai, which led me to researching the classic constructed format. I stumbled upon an Arsenal Pass deck tech from Hayden Dale, specifically his Road to Nationals Belittle Viserai list. I reviewed the cards in the deck, and that's when I found something that sealed the deal for me with Viserai. Something I like to call affinity for rune chants. Now, if you're confused by that statement, let me explain. Coming from Magic, there's a mechanic called affinity, specifically affinity for artifacts, which makes the card that you're playing with the mechanic cost one less for each artifact that you control. I've been playing affinity as my main archetype since its debut in 2003. It's been through multiple bannings, and I've been there the whole ride. Now, why does this matter? Well, Viserai has cards like Rune Flash, Drawn to the Dark Dimension, and those cards cost one less to play for each rune chant that you control. I couldn't help but laugh the first time I saw this. And there's more than just those two cards, but Viserai was clearly perfect for me to play. I also found out that he was the only hero that had a Fabled card that was made specifically for him, the Arknight Shard. I thought that was really cool. The next thing I knew, I had bought a case of Crucible of War, trying to chase the dream of opening an Arknight Shard. Spoiler alert, I didn't get one. Shocking, right? Even though the odds were stacked heavily against me, I still had to give it a shot. I couldn't be stopped. I had to see if maybe I could pull my own Arknight Shard. But that's how Fabled cards go. I still, to this day, haven't pulled a Fabled card. I've opened roughly 20 boxes. Average is 40, I believe. So, one day, maybe, I don't know. There are some people that have opened tons of boxes and never opened one, and then there are people that have opened like a handful and they've opened a bunch. What are you going to do? But from that point on, I've been tinkering with variations of the traditional Mauve Shrill build of Viserai, trying to find the exact formula that I enjoy. And that's an ongoing journey, to this day. It's going to be an ongoing journey moving forward, I'm sure. Not long after that, I went full-on Viserai stan. I had to have a Viserai playmat, so I got one of those off of Steve Argyle's website. And shortly after that, Fab Metal tokens had surfaced. When I saw the Runechant tokens, I immediately began talking to Brandon, who is the creator of Fab Metal tokens, and made plans to purchase a bunch of those. Now, I loved how these looked, but they were just a little too small. I found myself squinting when I would put the Runechants up at the combat chain to, try and figure out how many Runechants I was actually throwing at my opponent. But they were still gorgeous, I still appreciated them. And well, sadly for my wallet, about a month later, Brandon made streamer-size Runechant tokens, and he'd even adjusted the colors on top of that to make them more legible. It was an instant shut up and take my money scenario. I use these streamer-size Runechant tokens every time I play Viserai now, and I get compliments about them all the time, so if you're watching this, Brandon, thank you, man. These really do take the gameplay experience to the next level. So let's talk about my current Viserai build. I'm going to put the deck list on screen, and you don't have to look at it if you don't want to. This is supposed to be audio-only content, but I'm going to put it up there anyway. You can follow along, see the cards I'm talking about, see the full list. You can click the list in the description below if you want to look at it later. Now, if you aren't already aware, the game plan for Viserai is pretty basic. You want to be consistently applying pressure through physical and arcane damage at the same time until your opponent caves. It's an aggro deck. Did you think it was going to be more complicated than that? The main thing is that your opponent needs to respect your arcane damage. If they're not playing Arcane Barrier, you're probably going to have an easy time. And while AB1 is generally the game plan against Viserai, your opponent will be wishing that they played AB2 against you afterwards. Between the 6 Vexing Malice, constant Rosetta Thorn swings, and the addition of Looming Doom from Dynasty, you're throwing out chunks of 2 arcane damage every turn, sometimes multiple times a turn. And that's in addition to your rune chants. You'll likely be closing out games with 2 arcane damage more often than not. The number of games that I've played where my opponent is playing AB1, has 1 health, and I draw into a Vexing Malice is more than just a few. Respect the 2 arcane damage. For real. Outside of that, you've got powerful attacks like Shrill of Skullform and Deathly Duet, another addition to the deck from Dynasty. Both of these attacks come in hard damage-wise. Shrill comes in for 7 damage, or 8 damage if you consider the rune chant that it creates, and Deathly Duet can potentially come in for 6 damage, or 9 damage if you consider the rune chants that it can create, if you pitch to it correctly. Deathly Duet replaced Spellblade Assault for me in the red pitch when Dynasty came out, but I'm still running Spellblade Assault in the blue pitch over Deathly Duet. It becomes harder to pitch to it correctly in the late game to get full value from it, and it just ends up being less consistent, less consistently what you want it to be in the moment. Taking that into account, I'd much rather have Spellblade Assault to guarantee the continued pressure from the hybrid damage in the late game instead of just swinging for 4. Does that make sense? At least Blue Shrill comes in for 5 damage, so I'd rather run Shrill and Spellblade Assault in the blue than Deathly Duet, at least right now. Maybe I'll watch this video in a year and think I'm an idiot. Maybe you think I'm an idiot. But that's my philosophy with Viserai right now. The rest of your attacks consist of powerful go-agains, like Swarming Gloomveil and Rune Flash, in addition to Dread Tripych, which can provide fantastic late-game pressure. Now, I'm only running 2 Rune Flash because there have been times when you just get jammed up with 3. You draw them and you're just like, this is pretty much a red pitch right now, and that's not great. So I found that 2 is the sweet spot. Everything else in the deck is fairly standard, except maybe the singleton Lead the Charge Yellow. There are some Viserai players out there definitely that play Lead the Charge Yellow, but I wouldn't say it's stock compared to something like 9 Mavrian Skies, right? I found that 13 Mavrian Skies and Lead the Charge effects ends up being more consistent without flooding your hand with that type of effect. It's the right amount of redundancy, because you want one every turn. But sometimes 2 is, it feels bad. Sometimes you get 3. I had a game against someone at my LGS playing Dash, and it was Control Dash, and the matchup was very new for me. Didn't really know how to win. But it didn't help that for like 5 to 7 turns, I didn't draw any of these effects. And on the final turn of the game, before I eventually just gave it to him because he had it anyway, and I didn't want to go to time and all that, the final turn of the game, I drew 3 of the effects in one hand, and I was just like, bro. But it is what it is when it comes to that. You get bad hands. It just happens. I found that 4 Lead the Charge effects really does help with cards like Command and Conquer and Pursuit of Knowledge to just maintain your general game plan of pitch a blue, play Mavrian Skies or Lead the Charge, play an attack, and then follow it up with an attack from Rosetta Thorn. That's your general game plan for the turn, and if you can put Command and Conquer or Pursuit of Knowledge in there in place of your Runeblade attack, in place of your Shrill or your Deathly Duet, that's great. Now, it doesn't always work out like that, so I have been experimenting with 2 Lead the Charge Yellow, actually moving one of the Mavrian Skies red to the sideboard, which you might be like, what? But I move it there so that it's still in the 80, and I can bring it in for attrition-based matchups. Where I want to be playing a longer game, specifically like Dromai or Arachne, Also, in general, attacks with the Malverian Sky's effect are going to get blocked out, since your opponent doesn't want to get wrecked by Rune Chance. So running a 5th Lead the Charge helps with the consistency of the aforementioned generics, while really not hurting your game plan that much. That's my logic, at least. You can call me crazy in the comments down below, that's fine. But yeah, let's get to the sideboard. So this is where some people might look at this list and go, what's going on here? But I promise it'll all make sense. I really focus on versatility when it comes to my sideboard as best as possible. So starting with your main deck here, you've got 54 cards. Specifically, you've got 29 non-attack actions and 25 attack actions. So you'll generally either be putting in 5 attack actions and 1 non-attack action, or 4 attack actions and 2 that all you got, to maintain your 50-50 ratio. Command and Conquer will almost always come in, and Gorganian Tome is your go-to 30th non-attack action, assuming you're not playing against a hero that really goes wide with smaller attacks, in which case you'll probably be playing your 2 copies of that all you got, so you won't need your 30th non-attack action. As with most Viserai decks, the Arcanite Shard will end up being your 61st card when it's appropriate to bring it in, as to not throw off your ratios. But again, if you're playing against a hero that goes wide, you probably don't want it because you want to be able to block out with your hand. I'm looking at you, Fi. You've been an issue for me. Smashing Good Time is for Dash specifically, and it's only a 1-of to be that 30th non-attack if you're playing against Dash, because Dash has been fairly prevalent from what I can tell since the release of Dynasty. Dash got a lot of powerful tools, and for the upcoming ProQuest season, I think this is really going to come in handy. Next, you've got the 3 2-of attack actions. So we have Erase Face, Runic Reclamation, and Cryptic Crossing. Now you can bring these in where you feel it's appropriate, but generally, Cryptic Crossing is going to be your 4th and 5th attacks. If the other cards are needed more in a matchup, then yeah, you run those instead. But Cryptic Crossing is probably underrated. Now, I was playing Cryptic Crossing incorrectly when it got released, unfortunately, and I'm sure I was not alone in this, and if you play Cryptic Crossing, you probably know exactly what I'm about to say. A player in my LGS was kind enough to let me know in the first round of the night, thank God, that I was playing Cryptic Crossing wrong, because I had tried to do this to them. What I would try to do is pitch to something and have floating resources, and then use those resources under the premise that they came from either an attack or a non-attack, and then pitch the remainder from what was needed to activate the modes on Cryptic Crossing. Does that make sense? And what I learned was that it doesn't work like that. They have to be pitched directly to the card. Floating resources do not maintain properties, I guess is a good way of saying it. It is what it is. I was very high on the card before I found this out. I was running 3 of them. I think it was 2 in the main, 1 in the side. Now I've just put 2 in the side. And while, they generally do come in, I am lower on them in general. They kind of feel like filler at this point to hit that 60, to hit those 30 attacks. But they're really not. Cryptic Crossing can be very good against decks that you want to pressure them to block or take a card from them, and then also potentially have an arsenal for the turn. It's a good card, and if you're not trying it, I think you should. Pursuit of Knowledge is a fantastic card against decks that either don't want to block or Dromai. Decks where you can get on-hit effects 100% of the time. Viserai is known for his powerful 5-card hands if you have an arsenal, and I would have to say that 6 is better than 5. I don't know, maybe my math is off, but punishing your opponents for being greedy and aggressive for wanting to go wide and then, keep their hands and not block, it's going to benefit you with this card. This card generally replaces Dread Tripych when you do bring it in, and it presents a more aggressive pivot for the deck compared to how I normally play it, which is more of a mid-range game plan. This Rounds on Me is generally there for Fi, but if you run into a Crouching Tiger Katsu, it's fantastic against them as well. For Fi specifically, since it's a matchup that I have trouble with, I usually bring in 2 This Rounds on Me in place of Looming Doom, 2 Pursuit of Knowledge in place of Dread Tripych, 2 That All You Got, 3 Command and Conquer, and 1 Cryptic Crossing to round out the 60. And that's about it for the current build that I'm running. But there are some changes that I like to explore, and I'm sure I will explore over the next few weeks. That being an additional piece of Arcane Barrier, most likely Null Rune Boots. The 3rd That All You Got for the full playset, because that card is just insane. 2 copies of Unmovable Red, but that's probably mostly meta dependent, so we'll see where I fall in that, but it seems like a good inclusion. And like I mentioned before, I've been tinkering with 2 Lead the Charge Yellow instead of 1, moving the 3rd copy of Mauvrion Skies Red to the sideboard specifically for attrition matchups. I was using 1 to 2 copies of Blessing of Occult, since they're fantastic with Spellbound Creepers, and they activate all modes for Swarming Gloomveil on the following turn. There's a chance I'll probably go back to those at some point. Maybe I'll take out 1 Rattlebones for 1 Blessing of the Occult. I've also been considering Rune Blood Incantation. Even when I was running that, and at the time Read the Runes, I was only running 1 copy of each, and which one came in was purely dependent on whether I was going first or second. If I take out 1 Rattlebones, and I can find another card to take out, then I can put in 1 copy of Blessing of Occult and 1 copy of Rune Blood Incantation. So that's something to consider, but for now, I'll probably play this build for at least a few armories, leading up to ProQuest Season 3, at which point I'll make some final decisions based on what I'm expecting in the meta. But like I said earlier, this is me trying to find the build that I enjoy the most, and it's ongoing. It's going to be ongoing for the foreseeable future, more than likely. And I'm always making those tiny tweaks then, 1 or 2 cards in or out, just to try and figure out the exact sweet spot for the way that I like to play Viserai. Now, I'll put the Fabrary link in the description down below, but if you try the deck out, let me know what you think. If there's any changes you'd make to it after the fact, I'd love to know. So we've talked about my history with Viserai, and we've talked about my list that I'm currently playing. Let's talk about Viserai moving forward. First and foremost, I need to find Steve Argyle at an event. I need to get my Viserai and my Nebula Blade signed, because I'm a huge fan of signatures. It's another reason that I'm sad that I missed out on Pro Tour New Jersey, because he was there, but that'll happen eventually. It's really just a matter of time before I run into him at an event. Maybe SCG Con New Jersey in January, who knows. So regarding Viserai moving forward, there's 4 main topics that I want to talk about to wrap things up. 1 is the inevitable loss of Rosetta Thorn when Briar attains Living Legend. 2 is the Living Legend format in general, and how that pertains to Viserai. 3 is the possibility of Control/OTK Viserai, which I believe is on the horizon. And lastly, 4, what I would like to see in the next Viserai as a hero. Alright, so we'll rip the band-aid off first. Rosetta Thorn will likely be going away in Q1 or Q2 of 2023 when Briar attains Living Legend status. She's currently 78 points away from the 1,000 points that are needed, so it's essentially an inevitability at this point. And while non-Runeblade players will rejoice and come together in celebration, it really hurts for Runeblade players. It sucks. We'll definitely figure something out, And I'm really hoping that we get a new weapon that requires 1 resource to attack. Something that's not Reaping Blade. Because I really do enjoy my current Viserai game plan, and I don't want to have to switch to Reaping Blade. And that's not to say that I can't continue playing Viserai this way with a few tweaks, specifically to the attacks that I use, while employing something like Nebula Blade to balance out the blue pitch plan. But the 2-cost attacks are just so good. So we'll see what happens. But it's going to happen, and it's going to happen soon. So, Viserai players out there, enjoy it. Enjoy the Rosetta Thorn while we have it. Something I'm curious about is how the Living Legend format itself is going to function when it is finally released. Will all the cards be legal? Will we be restricted to Living Legend heroes specifically, or will we be able to use any adult heroes? I would imagine that it's anything goes as far as the heroes are concerned, but this is an excellent opportunity to explore a format with no banned cards. A format with Starvo, Chain, Prism, and Briar is going to be fairly degenerate. So let's just see what happens, right? I would hate to see the Living Legend format come out of the gate with banned cards like Drone of Brutality, Awakening, and Duskblade. Now, those are just some examples, but 2 of those cards I don't particularly care about. You can probably guess which ones. You can also probably guess where I'm going with this. I need Duskblade to be legal. I'm of the opinion that Duskblade did nothing wrong. Now, I wasn't playing back then, but still. You look at the card, it starts out small and becomes problematic over time. But there's one issue with that. Your deck can literally just say no to you. At any moment, in any game, no matter how good your ratios are, you could just brick. Viserai players, you've played Sonata Arcanix before, right? You can't tell me you've never bricked on that card, and that's 3 cards with no investment. You can very easily brick on 4 cards. It's going to happen. Now, is it going to happen often enough that Duskblade can be unbanned in like Classic Constructed? Probably not. So, I get it. But I wonder if there's a world where LSS could make a card that removes counters from a card. I wonder how much that would affect Dory. But I also wonder if that would make Duskblade okay. If they would be like, hey, the tech's out there. If it gets out of hand, you got 80 cards to work with. Just a thought. But, I mean, I get it. I get why it's banned in Classic Constructed. I get why it's banned in Blitz. I see literally no reason for it to be banned in the Living Legend format upon release. We should give it a chance. And assuming that we can play any adult hero in the format, which I'm sure that's how it'll be, I'll be front and center with Viserai and Duskblade. You can count on that. That leads me into the third topic, which is Control/OTK Viserai. With the release of Dynasty, it feels like they're slowly creeping toward that archetype for Viserai. Between Looming Doom, Annals of Sutcliffe, and Blessing of the Occult, which is essentially a second copy of Read the Runes, you can't tell me that that's not coming. It's just a matter of time. A player in my LGS, who I won't name because I haven't asked them if it's okay for me to name them, but you know who you are, they've been brewing a Control Viserai build, but I feel like it just needs one more push to get there. Truly, I think that even just one card would be enough to make it a very viable build. Now, with all of that out of the way, I want to talk about what I want to see in the next Viserai hero, whether it be the Starvo treatment or the eventual replacement if Viserai hits Living Legend. And this is going to be with the current knowledge that we have of talents. But I would like to see a light Runeblade Viserai that also brings with it a redemption arc for the hero. Now, I could be totally off base. I'm not a lore guru, but it's not totally his fault that he's evil. He's been through some shit. Lord Sutcliffe put him through some shit. You know, he put the Arknight Shard in his chest cavity. You can't blame the guy. I'm sure there's a lot more to that, and I'm sure that people who are deeply engrossed in the lore are probably like, this guy, he doesn't know anything about this. But I would like to see a redemption arc regardless for Viserai, and I think that a light Runeblade Viserai would be pretty cool. Having the existing Runeblade card pool, which has a generally dark theme, mixed with the light card pool, would just make for an awesome aesthetic as a deck. And I'm a big fan of mixing light and dark elements within an individual hero in all types of fantasy media, where the hero has to walk a fine line between light and dark, where he can utilize the strength of the darkness within while trying not to fall victim to it, you know? Maybe I'm just too much of an edgelord. So in preparation for this segment, I actually made a light Runeblade Viserai the other day. I knew I was going to be talking about it, and I wanted to be able to give an example of what that looks like in my head. So obviously, the hero is Viserai. Maybe his name is Viserai the Redeemed, or something like that. He's a light Runeblade hero with 4 intellect and 40 health. Pretty standard. He has a once per turn action that costs 2 resources, and you have to put a card from your graveyard into your soul. If an attack action card was pitched to activate this ability, your next attack action card this turn gains Go Again. If a non-attack action card was pitched to activate this ability, create a rune chant. If a card named Arknight Shard was pitched to activate this ability, banish Arknight Shard, and you may put a card named Purified Arknight Shard into the arena from outside the game. Go Again. Now, before we get into the Purified Arknight Shard, I know you gotta wait. Let's talk about this ability. Having the activation be 2 resources makes it more difficult to pitch into to activate all the modes of this ability. It's totally possible and reasonable. I mean, look at Deathly Duet, we talked about that earlier. But it's more difficult to do than if it were to cost 3 resources. You have to really work with what you have. 3 resources, why I mentioned that, is what I initially had this ability at, but then I thought about that. Also, 2 resources plays more into the light theme, where yellow pitch matters. You could build to utilize both modes in like a hybrid build, or you could go purely aggressive, pitching only attacks to get Go Again, or maybe you want to go full control by pitching non-attack actions to build up rune chants. And I thought that was pretty neat. Originally, I had cards going to his soul from your hand, but then I realized it would be really difficult to continuously activate the ability, considering how it functions, while trying to maintain tempo in the game. So having cards go from your graveyard to your soul felt more interesting, because it also kind of represents Viserai being cleansed or purified, if that makes sense. You know, you're turning necrotic energies into radiant energies, right? Plus it makes your hands a lot more playable, obviously. Now, the Purified Arknight Shard. Obviously, the ability is phrased in a way that the hero can be played and function without this and without an Arknight Shard. Because I wouldn't want to price people out of a hero by making them play like that, by making it required. Kind of like the Emperor. I can't see people playing the Emperor if they don't have 2 Command and Conquers in their Blitz deck. I just can't. This hero I could see. I think you would want it, but I could see it being played without. The Purified Arknight Shard would have the legendary keyword, but it wouldn't be a fabled card like the Arknight Shard. It might not even be legendary. It could be, but it could also be majestic. In fact, it should probably be majestic. But I don't think that it should be fabled, because it should be made with the secondary market in mind, and even though these are all hypothetical things, I think that would be a horrible decision if it were a fabled card. Now, the Purified Arknight Shard would be a light Runeblade card. I don't know exactly what type it would be, because I don't know that the type that is most appropriate for it exists yet, but it would definitely have the item subtype. It wouldn't have a pitch value, it would have no defense, and it would have no cost. As such, there's essentially no way to play the card itself, so you would need to get it into play using Viserai's ability, which is why it plays from outside the game. If you're familiar with Magic, playing from outside the game means that it comes from your sideboard, not just, across the hall. So it has to be within your 80. But for this instance, it doesn't make sense to be in your 60. So some phrasing is maybe required on the card to dictate that, you shouldn't put it in your 60, or maybe you can't put it in your 60. But hopefully you understand what I'm trying to get at. The card itself reads, Action. Remove a card from your soul, create a rune chant token, go again. Essentially, it would be meant as a combo piece to close out the game. You build up your soul and possibly additional rune chants throughout the game, then use the Purified Arcanite Shard's ability to pump out more rune chants by draining your soul, and then you attack for the win. I thought that was a pretty cool ability. You can build up rune chants and your soul throughout the game while playing defensively. Then you purify your Arcanite Shard once you run into it. Then you drain your soul to amass even more rune chants. And maybe you finish the game off with the 9th Blade of the Blood Oath. Is that too anime? I think it's awesome, but tell me what you think in the comments down below. How would you make a light Runeblade Viserai, or would you rather see Viserai with a different talent? Let me know. Tell me if you enjoyed the video too, or what topic you'd like me to cover in the future. While you're down there, click the like button, hit subscribe if you want, if that's your thing. And with that, we've reached the end of today's episode. I hope you enjoyed listening. I hope you'll come back again. And as usual, until next time, stay safe, keep playing great games, and I'll catch you on the next one. See ya.